This is the Fuji X-S10. It's Fuji's latest 26 megapixel APS-C camera, and it kind of marks a slight change in direction, and it's slightly different from all of the previous X system cameras in that they've abandoned the traditional retro styling and analog controls that you found on the previous cameras and gone for a much more kind of traditional and simplified layout. Now, it doesn't really have an obvious predecessor in the lineup. It's kind of like the X-T4 in most of its specifications, except it's considerably smaller. And it's kind of like the X-T30. It has the same image sensor of the X-T4, the X-T3, the X-T30, and the X Pro 3. But what it does have that the X-T30 doesn't have is image stabilization built into the body, and it's a very different shape and feels like a very different camera to the X-T30. So it seems to me that Fuji are very definitely pitching this at video makers and people new to the Fuji system. Now, it's surprisingly small and light. That was the first thing that I noticed when I took it out the box. It's really not that much different from the X-T30 when you put them side by side. It's a little bit longer across the body. The main body, the top plate, is lower, although when you take into account the flash bulge, it's about the same. But what surprises me most is that it has the same thickness, which is interesting because this has, as I said, the image stabilization, which was something that Fuji they originally introduced it in the X-H1, which was a really big, bulky camera. And then the X-T4, which, while it's more or less the same as the X-T3, you still feel a lot of the thickness in the body. So for Fuji to have scaled the stabilization down even more to put it in a body this thin is really quite impressive. And it does feel very light. Now, it's a little bit heavier than the X-T30, 82 grams. But you're really not going to notice a difference. It really does feel very light, and with this big grip on the side, it feels very good in the hands. Now, as I said, this has been designed, I think, for video users, for holding it with one hand, for shooting video handheld, and it does kind of feel better than the X-T30, which has this very shallow grip. And I've always loved these cameras, but one of the things about them is that, you know, I found that my finger would kind of wave around at the bottom. I couldn't really get a very good grip on it. That's not really a problem with the X-S10. It really does feel very good in the hand. Your hand wraps right around it, and it feels very good to use. Now, in comparison with the X-T4, it really is significantly smaller and lighter, which is impressive considering it has the same image processor, the same sensor, and pretty much the same image stabilization. On the X-T4, you've got 6.5 stops of stabilization. In scaling this down, this goes down to just 6 stops. So you lose half a stop of image stabilization, but I think that's kind of compensated for the fact that it is so much smaller and is so much lighter. What you don't get is the battery from the X-T4. It's got this much deeper grip, and I was kind of hoping that it would have the same bigger battery that the X-T4 has got, which gives it a much longer, which gets a lot more shots out of one charge, but it doesn't. It has the same battery as the X-T30, the X-T3, and because of the IBIS, you do lose a little bit in terms of the number of shots that you can get. I think it's graded for 310 shots as opposed to 380 on the X-T30. So battery life is going to suffer for the IBIS. Now, it's also got the same flip out screen as the X-T4, which in my experience splits opinion among photographers. Some people really love it because they shoot a lot of videos and they like to be able to see themselves while they're shooting it for vlogs. I'm using the same thing on the X-T4 to record this video now, and it really does help. But if you're not interested in shooting vlogs, then a lot of people really don't like this. They find it sticks out. It's not as easy to use as the articulating screen on things like the X-T3. However, it does, I mean, you get more articulation. It's got more flexibility than the articulated screen on the X-T30, which only goes horizontally. It doesn't articulate vertically, whereas this does. It's exactly the same as the X-T4 screen. Now, originally when I did the X-T4 video, L brackets were a little bit of a problem, finding an L bracket that would work with the flip out screen. But eventually third-party systems came out, and that's not really a problem now. It's not perfect, but you can get L brackets that work with this flip out screen. Now, I think the biggest difference that people are going to notice between this and other cameras in the X system lineup are the complete change of controls. I've been using the Fuji system for about 5 years, and I really do like the analog dials. I really do like having the ISO on a dial, the shutter speed on a dial, the aperture on the lens on the front, and I've got completely used to that, and it's second nature and very intuitive for me to use now. This doesn't have that. It's very different in the way that it operates, and that's taken me a while to get used to. I've had to overcome my muscle memory, and do things that were previously automatic. I find myself having to think about them more with this camera. It's the first camera that I've seen in the Fuji X system lineup that has aperture priority, shutter priority, things like that. Now, those functions were available on the other cameras. You just accessed them in different ways. If you wanted a shutter priority, for example, then you would just set the aperture ring to auto. If you wanted aperture priority, then you just would set the shutter dial to auto, and it worked in that way. This way it's much more direct, which it is simpler. That's why Fuji have done it. They're trying to I think make the camera more comfortable to beginner users, to make it much more easy to step into if you haven't been using the Fuji system. And I can see that that does work. It's just as someone who's coming from other Fuji cameras, it took me about half a day to get my head around how this works differently. So working my way through the controls, over here on the left, this is where you have the function dial on the X-T30, and on the larger cameras, the X-T4, X-T30, it's the ISO dial. Here this just basically accesses the Fujifilm simulation, and it's got this button here for the pop-up flash. In the middle, where you have the shutter dial on the X-T30 and all the Fuji cameras, this is now the function dial. So this is where you go if you want to select aperture priority, if you want to select video, and if you want to go to any of the custom functions. And what was the exposure compensation dial here? Well, it kind of still is the exposure compensation, but it doesn't work. It's not marked like that, and it doesn't always work. It has different functions. What Fuji have done with this is they've combined the exposure compensation dial and this dial on the back of the X-T30. They've basically combined them into one dial. So when you're shooting in any auto mode like aperture priority or shutter priority, then this dial here basically is the exposure compensation, and the shutter is controlled by this dial on the front. But when you're shooting in manual, then this now controls the shutter speed. I'm not quite sure why they've done that. For me, it's a little bit confusing to have the shutter speed move from one dial to the other depending on whether I'm shooting manually or auto. That's going to take a little while to get used to. Now, when you're shooting in shutter priority mode or in manual mode, it's kind of like being in the T mode with the T setting here on the X-T30, in that the shutter speed goes all the way up to 15 minutes at one-stop increments. And that's something that I quite like, particularly if you're doing long exposures, because I do a lot of exposures that are above 30 seconds that are 1 minute or 2 minutes, and on most cameras that kind of tops out at 30 seconds, and then you have to go to bulb. But here you can do an exposure of up to 15 minutes just from using the shutter speed dial. Now, for access to the ISO controls, there is no ISO dial like on the X-T4. That's the same as the X-T30, which didn't have a dedicated ISO dial. What I used to do was click on this button and select the ISO using that. This does have a dedicated ISO button here, which you press this, and then it works in combination with the joystick at the back just to select the ISO. Now, again, this took me a little while to get used to, and I found myself accidentally pressing the Q button too many times, and I wanted to change ISO. But again, that's just muscle memory. It does make sense. It's a logical layout, but it just is something that took me a while to get used to. Now, another thing that's moved is the bracketing button, which again is a function that I use a lot as a landscape photographer. That used to be on the function dial here if you wanted bracketing. It's now on the delete button. So you press this here to move it to go into the bracketing menu. Notice this camera is very clearly pitched as a video camera. Video access to video is relatively simple. It doesn't have the switch, the lever to shoot between video mode and still photography mode, which the X-T4 has, which is something that I do like a lot. I like to be able to switch the camera between those two modes. It has the video mode on the function dial here, the same as the X-T30. When you put this into video mode, then all of the controls on the camera work manually in video. However, if you're in photography mode, if you're shooting still photos, you do have this red button on the top which you can hit, and the camera will start recording video automatically. Now, when you do this, you don't get manual control of the video functions. What it's going to do is shoot video in full auto mode. So the ISO is going to be auto, the shutter speed and the aperture is going to be auto, but it does give you that option to be able to shoot video very quickly. Now, if you have the camera in video mode, if you want to shoot between auto exposure and manual exposure controls, then what you have to do is press the Q button, and that gives you access to be able to change between manual and automatic settings. And one of the quirky things that I found is that when you're shooting video, if you want to change aperture, it's done with this dial on the front, not with the dial on the lens. Now, again, I think that's because Fuji envisioned people shooting with this one-handed, and they want people to be able to change it with their finger rather than having to hold it with the second hand. Not sure. Maybe it's because of that. I really don't know. And after using this for a few days, it does start to feel quite intuitive. It feels very good in the hand. It does feel very easy to be shooting stills, to be shooting video, and to switch between the two. I've got a bit of a problem with the layout of some of these buttons on the top here. I've accidentally started recording quite a few times when I've just been wanting to use the ISO or the Q button, and I do think that these buttons could be laid out better, perhaps with some of them placed on the back here. But that's just something that probably I've got to get used to and give it a few more days, and I'll stop recording when I don't want to be recording video. And one other significant difference that you'll notice between the controls of the camera is that there's no button here to change between the focus modes, whereas on all the other X systems you've got the dial here which gives you manual, continuous or single focus. That's not here. If you want to change focus modes, you actually have to go into the menu and do it there. Now, I think the main feature of this camera, and probably the reason for its existence, is the image stabilization in a smaller body. Fuji came quite late to the game with image stabilization. The first camera that had it was the X-H1, which was a very big camera, almost DSLR sized camera. Then they used it in the X-T4, which I thought was a much better, much smaller, much more practical implementation of image stabilization. And now this, which is not really that much bigger than the X-T20, X-T30. You do lose, as I said, half a stop of image stabilization, but 6 stops is still really impressive. The other payoff, again, as I said earlier, is that because it still has a smaller battery, the image stabilization does affect battery life, and battery life isn't as good as the X-T30 or anywhere near as good as the 500 to 600 shots that you get on the X-T4. But is it worth it? Now, 6 stops of image stabilization, what does that actually mean? So let's have a look at this test with a still photograph. This is shot at 55 millimeters, and the golden rule for camera shake is that you should always, the shutter time should always double the focal length of the camera. So this is shot at 55 millimeters, so I should be looking at something like 110, but let's say 1/125 for my shutter speed. Now, 6 stops slower than that is actually about half a second, which is quite a long time to be hand holding a camera at 55 millimeters, which is about 82 millimeters on a full frame equivalent. So this is shot handheld for half a second, and you can see here it really is, it's not perfect, there's a little bit of shake there, but it really is good. So that's the image stabilization doing its job. And I think with video, image stabilization really comes into its own. It allows you to do a lot more shots without having to set up a tripod, keeping the camera steady, keeping the image steady. It just means that you can shoot much more quickly and much more easily on the go. So again, this is at 55 millimeters, and the longer the focal length, the more any shake is magnified down the lens. So you can see here, this is what it looks like handheld with image stabilization on, and this is what it looks like with image stabilization off. Now, I'm shooting handheld a lot more often, both in my still photography. All of these images were shot handheld. I tend to shoot a lot of panoramas handheld because I'm out hiking a lot. Sometimes when the light's changing very quickly, I don't have time to stop and set up the tripod, and I tend to shoot handheld. And I'm also shooting a lot more video handheld. And just to be able to shoot B-roll very quickly on the go without having to set up a tripod, without having to take my time, image stabilization really does help for that. So for me, I wouldn't call it a deal breaker, but it is a game changer, if that makes sense. All right, now let's have a look at the image quality that you can expect from the X-S10. Now I'm going to do this in Lightroom because it's a software that I use most often. You can get slightly more detail right out of the camera if you're using Capture One Pro, but generally I use Lightroom for most of my work. I just find it a lot more intuitive, a lot faster to use, and I think it's a software that most people use, so that's what I'm going to use to analyze the files. Now, the camera, as I said before, has exactly the same sensor as the X-T4, the X-T3, the X-T30 and the X Pro 3. So you're going to get exactly the same image quality from this camera as you would do from any of those cameras. Now, when I'm looking at the image quality here, there's nothing scientific about this. There's nothing particularly measured. They're basically just some shots that I've done when I've been out in the field. And the thing that interests me when I look at image quality is how does the camera perform in the field? I'm not really interested in resolution charts and things like that. I just basically want to know is, do I get good enough and sharp enough results from my work? So this is the first image. Now, I chose to do an image, I wanted to do one with lots of foliage and lots of detail so you could get an idea of how much detail the sensor can render. This is shot with the 10-24, and you can see here that the camera handles all this detail in the leaves around here and in this area very well. It really is capable of pulling out a lot of detail. It's the same lens, but this shot doesn't have anything like the same level of detail before, but again, you can see how sharp it is. There's a lack of noise. Generally, I don't really have any problem with noise with Fuji cameras. Now, this next image is taken at ISO 1000. I wanted to give an example of what you could expect when you're shooting with high ISO. Now, again, you can see here that the detail, the contrast is really nice, even at ISO 1000. I've shot with other Fuji cameras since the X-T2 up to ISO 2500, ISO 3200 when I'm shooting astro shots or when I'm shooting the Aurora, and I've always been very happy with the results. Generally with high ISO, it's when you start to push out the shadows that you start to see a degradation of the image. And while you can see a little bit here in the shadows over here on the back of the tree, it's starting to look a little bit washed out. Generally, the performance is still really nice. It's still really contrast, even with the shadows pushed up quite a lot. Now, this next image, this is really just to give an example of the dynamic range. You can see here that the highlights are clipping and that it's got a lot of shadow. So let's just have a look what happens when we pull down the highlights and when we pull out the shadows a little bit more just to see. And you can see here just, I mean, it's really no great image, but you can see here that the highlight recovery is very good. The shadow recovery, there's plenty of detail here. It's not washed out at all. We don't lose contrast, we don't lose color. And I've been very happy with the dynamic range of the Fuji cameras. Obviously, I bracket when I'm doing some shots. If you're looking straight into the light, you have to bracket when you're shooting at sunrise or sunset with pretty much any camera. But overall, the dynamic range performance is really nice. Now, those previous images hadn't been edited at all. They were straight out of the camera, but this is just an example of a few edited images. This is one that I shot the other night. It's a long exposure of about 2 minutes. And because I haven't had a lot of opportunity to use the X-S10 shooting landscapes because I've been under lockdown here in Portugal for the last few weeks, this is an image taken with the X-T4, which again has exactly the same sensor, exactly the same image performance. So this is an image shot with the X-T4, and this has been processed. Again, you can zoom in here and you can see the kind of detail that the camera is capable of producing. And this is just to give an example with another lens. This is with the 55-200. Let's just zoom in and look at the detail here in the mountain face, or if we go down to the Alpe d'Huez, you can see the detail in these huts and the trees here. And just overall, the image quality is exceptional on the camera. It's more than good enough for my purposes. I've been using Fuji cameras for 5 years, and pretty much since the X-T2, I've always been really satisfied with the level of detail, the level of resolution, the noise performance, high ISO performance, and the dynamic range. Now, when it comes to video, this is clearly what the X-S10 has been designed around, and as such, you'd expect it to stand out. So like the X-T4 and the X-T30, you get 10-bit recording, and like the X-T4, you get 4K video up to 30 frames per second for 30 minutes, which is considerably longer than the X-T30, which tops out at 10 minutes. Unlike the X-T4 though, it won't shoot 4K at 60 frames per second, and like the X-T30, it will only transfer at 100 mbs at 4K with 200 mbs at Full HD. Full HD recording is up to 30 minutes, the same as the X-T4 and double the 50 minutes of the X-T30.
You also get high-speed recording at full HD of 240 frames per second, which gives you 8 times slow motion, as well as 120 frames per second, which is the fastest that you can get on the X-T30. Now, of course, the camera shoots in f-log, which is like a raw photograph. It gives you a flat file with all of the image data, which makes it a lot easier when it comes to color grading to get a look that's consistent with video that you've shot on other devices, like a drone, for example. And of course, you've got all the regular Fujifilm simulations like the Provia, which is the standard. You've got the super saturated Velvia that's really strong with the colors. Classic Chrome, which is really nice, which is a desaturated, slightly faded look. Eterna, which is a more faded for a really cinematic look. You've got the Eterna Bleach Bypass, which is a high contrast, desaturated look, and then Acros, which is a high contrast black and white. The stabilization really comes into its own when you're shooting the video, and while it doesn't replace a gimbal if you're shooting handheld, it does make vlogging and doing handheld shots for B-roll a lot smoother. And overall then, it's just a great video camera with a fantastic range of options, which makes it perfect for small film projects. It's quick and easy to start shooting with, it's a pleasure to use. The really big grip feels great for hand holding, and the output is just excellent.
So to conclude then, well, it's different. It's different from any of the other cameras in the Fuji X lineup. And I must admit that I really do like the retro styling and the analog controls on the other Fuji cameras. It's something that I find intuitive and more than that, a pleasure to use. Fuji cameras were one of the reasons why I fell in love with photography again about 5 years ago. So I do miss that. It doesn't have weather sealing. Now, I don't know about weather sealing. I've been using the Fuji system for about 5 years, and I've used the X-T10, the X-T20 and the X-T30, and I've used them in horrific conditions, in snow, in rain, in dust. Likewise, the lenses that I use, the 55-200, the 10-24, are not weather sealed lenses, and I've never really had that much of a problem with the lack of weather sealing. This camera, the build quality feels very similar to the X-T30. Maybe a little bit more plasticky around the dials, it's hard to say, and I can't speak to the long-term effect of it, in the long-term usage of it in terms of weather sealing, but I can say that with other Fuji cameras I've never really had any problem with the build quality, with how tough they are, whether they've had weather sealing or not. So for me personally, I still haven't decided yet whether I'm going to use this or continue using the X-T3 as my second camera body. I must admit I'm still really attached to everything about the X-T3, to the way that it feels, to the way that it handles. However, the image stabilization on this is a big plus point. Likewise, if you're coming from the X-T20 or the X-T30, this is going to feel like a very different camera. It's feels very different in the hand, and as I've said, the controls are very different. So it's going to really come down to how much you use IBIS or how much you shoot video. If you're just a still photographer, you're not going to notice any difference whatsoever in the quality of the images that you get from this. However, if you shoot a lot handheld, if you're shooting sports, if you're shooting theaters or concerts or venues, things like that, then the image stabilization is going to help a lot. Likewise with things like weddings. If you shoot a lot of video, then it probably is worth upgrading from the X-T30 to this if you don't mind losing the retro controls. It has a lot better video functions and the longer shooting time in 4K, and the image stabilization really does make a lot of difference in handheld shooting, along with a much bigger grip. And if you're new to Fuji and have never used one of their cameras before, then you're probably not going to be as attached to the retro styling and to the analog dials as I am. And in that case, it's well worth looking at this camera, particularly if you're looking for a camera to get started in filmmaking, to get started in making vlogs, or in my case, if you're looking for a secondary camera to complement a camera that you already use for shooting films or photography. This has excellent still image quality. It has excellent video quality and a really wide range of video functions, and the image stabilization make it incredibly useful for all kinds of handheld shooting. It's comfortable to use, the grip feels really great in the hand, and overall it's just an excellent camera and well worth taking a look at. So I think that's everything for this video. I hope it's been useful and I hope it's been informative. If you've got any questions at all, just drop me a comment or question in the box below or send me an email. At this point, I'd really like to say thanks to the guys at Moment in the US who sent me this camera for review and have been incredibly supportive and helpful in getting it to me, so thanks to them. If you're looking to buy camera gear or video gear online, check them out. They've got an incredibly good range of stock and really, really good customer service. They're great guys over there. So big thumbs up to them and big thanks to them. And basically, that's everything. So as ever, thanks for watching. Good luck with your shooting and take care.